Danny Funt, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
The American Gambling Association estimated that Americans put $1.76 billion into legal wagers for Super Bowl 60. Why are so many Americans betting so big on the big game?
Yeah, that number made it the most legally bet on sporting event in American history, which sounds noteworthy, and it used to be, but now every Super Bowl sets that record just because the growth of this business is so phenomenal and unrelenting. The fact, that so much has changed in such a short amount of time. This all started thanks to a Supreme Court decision in 2018 that struck down a federal ban that had confined legal bookmaking to Nevada. So they've had sports betting since I think the 1950s. But thanks to a federal law, it wasn't allowed to expand outside of Nevada. And the leagues in particular had been the ones who campaigned for that law and argued so intensely that it should stay that way. And yet, thanks to this Supreme Court decision in 2018, everything changed. It initiated this race for states to legalize as quickly as possible, and also in the process to pass bills that were very favorable to the gambling industry. The leagues were lobbying very aggressively to encourage that. As profound a 180 as you could imagine from how staunchly opposed they had been just a few years earlier. And as a result, sports has changed fundamentally, where even if you're not a gambler, this, especially in states that have yet to legalize, like California and Texas, but wherever you are, even if you're not betting, it's changed how you experience sports. The advertising is inescapable. So much sports media talks about sports through a gambling lens. And of course, there have been some scandals where gambling is corrupting sports. So, for all those reasons, it's just created this phenomenal appetite for gambling. And the fact that 1.8 billion was wagered on the Super Bowl is noteworthy. But I think what's even more noteworthy is that people are betting on almost that rate every day of the year now. The Super Bowl has kind of gotten less remarkable because people are betting at that clip on basically every game they're watching to some degree.
Now, betting in sports is nothing new. I mean, you had back in 1919, you had the Black Sox scandal. I did an interview with an NFL historian. He was the Giants, Tim Rooney, their founder. He was a bookie. Even the GOAT, Michael Jordan, he once stated that he doesn't have a gambling problem, he has a competition problem. It seems like gambling and sports, more than anything else, seems to be intersect or intertwined. Why do you think that is?
I loved learning about that history, and I had always planned. I'll get to your question, but I just want to note I had always planned on incorporating some of that history in my book because it's you need to know that context to understand what's happened in recent years and currently. I didn't realize it would be one of my favorite chapters to write because I hadn't realized that basically since the creation of professional sports in America, there have been people gambling on it. So much so that in the early days of pro baseball in like the 1870s, the New York Times was editorializing that baseball was a contrivance for gambling and that they wouldn't accept the term national pastime if all it was fodder for gamblers. So that is remarkable to realize it goes back that far. I think part of it is just America has a deeply rooted gambling culture, period. I learned that the founders at Jamestown, the first English colony, where they had a lottery that funded the creation of that colony. There were lotteries that funded the American Revolution. There were gamblers, even among the Puritan refugees, who came and founded Massachusetts and other states. They had a huge gambling problem even back then, and people who came to the US with fresh eyes were kind of in awe and shocked that there was such a gambling culture here. So, to that extent, it's not surprising that sports would just be yet another thing to bet on in addition to cards and dice and what have you. But I think it's natural that uh, that would be an attraction. And also, you were touching on like Michael Jordan and a lot of famous athletes who are famous gamblers. And people have explained to me that that is not a coincidence, that the same things that make you good at sports, being maniacally competitive, not accepting defeat, being somewhat delusional about your abilities to overcome the odds, that can make you inveterate gambler too, for better or worse. So that history is so important to understanding why things changed and also why some of the problems that we're seeing now about addiction rates and gambling corrupting sports and changing how people engage with the games isn't all that surprising. There was a century plus of evidence that would lead us to believe that was going to be the consequence of making gambling so accessible. And yet, just the priorities changed in a blink, and people were willing to tolerate that. At least people in power who stood to make a lot of money thanks to all that's happened.
So is that the reason why you wrote this book?
Yeah, I felt like I wanted to get to the bottom of why they had that change of heart. The leagues, politicians, people in sports beyond the commissioners, because they could not have been more staunch about describing gambling as an evil, as they put it, that would be, as the commissioner of baseball said barely a decade ago, the deadliest of all things that could happen to sports would be the expansion of gambling outside of Nevada. To hear them go from speaking in those terms to now being gambling's biggest champions, I felt demanded an explanation. And I felt like what they had said on that was scant and unsatisfying, and I wanted to either force them to elaborate or to investigate what really changed their minds. And I'm very happy that I was able to shed some new light on that. The other, you asked, what was the reason for the book? I'd say that, and also these betting companies like FanDuel and DraftKings have become such household names, such Goliaths in the sports business, and yet they remain kind of mysterious. Like people generally don't know what it's like to work at one of those companies. They don't know how they would think about their customers behind closed doors. All of that I thought would be fascinating to pull back the curtain on for a book. And again, I got very lucky to speak with dozens and dozens of people who work in all sorts of roles at all sorts of levels at those companies. And I think that really makes the book eye-opening because even I, after having covered this for years, I was deeply curious to know what is it like to approve bets? What is it like to cater to these so-called VIP customers? What's it like to be a responsible gaming manager at a sports book where you're supposedly looking out for the safety of your customers? All of that was enigmatic, and I think the book succeeds at revealing what that actually looks like.
A quick pause. We'll be right back to the conversation. Thank you so much for your time watching the video. I really appreciate it. There's one small request I have for you. We're just starting out with the channel. I could really use your help. If you could hit the like button, if you could subscribe to the channel, and you could comment below, it would really help me and help me boost this show on the algorithm. So thank you so much, and right back to the conversation. You listed out a little bit in that there's been quite a bit of pivot from the legal side and the sports league side. So it used to be, betting or gambling on sports was completely illegal, or we don't want to talk about it at all, to we're going to do, what's our prop bets and what's the over unders. We're going to estimate on virtually everything, even on the sports cast. But what is the culture around sports betting for the everyday American, right? Because we didn't have access like this ever before. Maybe somebody would have the fantasy football league in their office or, their high school friend group. Maybe they do a little March Madness, but, it was just kind of a fun social activity to go around with your comrades here. But now it seems to be an everyday occurrence.
And that is really the essence of why this is so significant because the industry and the politicians who sided with the industry, the leagues, one of their central arguments was that they wouldn't be creating new gamblers. They would just be moving people from betting illegally through street bookies and offshore websites to legal operators that are taxed and regulated, and that would be in the interest of those people. It's similar to the argument for legalizing marijuana. The case was this is happening anyway, let's just do it in the sunlight so we can protect people and also tax it. And yet, to your point, that's not what's happened at all. There are clearly way more people who are comfortable downloading an app on the App Store and depositing money through their bank or Venmo or PayPal or their credit card or whatever, versus using crypto to bet on some shady website that's being managed in Costa Rica or something. So that created a whole mainstream of gambling that never existed. And it's not just the number of people betting, it's how they're betting. The fact that 95% of this business is now conducted online enables so much more types of bets than you could ever do if you had to call a bookie or go to Nevada. And it's common sense. Like a big growth area is what's called micro betting, which is not just betting on who will win or lose, but on will the batter in a baseball game who's up right now, will they get a hit or make out? Or in a football game, will this possession result in a score, a punt? That level of frenetic micro betting is essentially a creation of the legal online ecosystem because logistically it wasn't possible, and also it requires the cooperation of the leagues to provide real-time statistics that allow that sort of odds making and betting in turn. And the fact that the leagues are now so integrated with the betting business and make a ton of money by providing that data, that's a big part of it. So I'll just say in kind of in conclusion on this point, sometimes you see studies that are, I think, trying to make the industry's argument look more flattering, and they'll say this many people were betting, and now this many people are betting, and it's not that big an increase. And the obvious thing that they're obscuring is, yeah, Riley might have done a March Madness pool once a year, and now he bets a few times a week, a lot of money on every game he's watching. Sure, Riley was betting a little before, and now he's betting now, but the nature of his betting is night and day.
Now to go with betting, there was the office pool or maybe people in your general vicinity, but a lot of these like betting communities are all online now. And with any like subculture or community, there's like lingo and titles and stuff. Can you break it down? Because I'm a pretty novice in this area here. What are some of the tags or names that individuals within the betting community kind of go under? Who I think you mentioned like sharps. Also, what do these providers call their customers too internally? Because you broke that down a little bit in your book, and I found that very intriguing as well.
Yeah, this is old lingo, and it kind of has a romance to it, if you allow that. If you've ever seen like Guys and Dolls or The Music Man, these gambling themed Broadway shows, there's a lot of that even in there when they're talking about dice and cards and stuff. So a sharp is what how people describe professional gamblers, people who approach it with a really sophisticated strategy and have an edge that allows them to at least hope to come out ahead over time. A square is the vast majority of people. These are recreational bettors who are kind of going off intuition or crude analysis and don't have really any chance of coming out ahead. And they can't overcome the house edge, which is referred to as the vigorish or the vig. I learned that the vigorish is a kind of bastardization of the word vinegar because once gamblers realized they were betting at a fundamental disadvantage, they felt bitter in the way you might if you eat some vinegar. So uh, there's a lot of that. And then uh, sometimes they'll refer to the most profitable customers, the people who are betting a ton of money, as whales, and everyone else as fish. These sort of, the $20 bettors are the fish to them. Um, you've got your bookies who are taking the bets, on and on. I mean, that's a fun side of it for sure. It's got this kind of Dickensian language that goes with this business.
that terminology was often used maybe for people that would visit Vegas and everything. I think it's gotten a little bit more mainstream over the years, but you kind of shared that these daily fantasy sports leagues, the DraftKings, they come in here roughly, what was the time frame? 2016. And I mean, it goes from like there's no betting or anything on daily fantasy sports to like if you were listening to ESPN at this time, you were getting peppered with ads by DraftKings and FanDuel here. What happened in that time frame about 10 years ago that really lit gasoline on fire with these companies?
Yeah, it was a little bit before then. It exploded in like 2015, 2016, but those companies were founded shortly after 2010. And the loophole that they seized on, and that some other companies had seized on earlier, but as often happens, the people who are first to it aren't necessarily the most successful, was so Congress banned bookmaking outside Nevada in 1992. And it had been largely illegal before then anyway, but this kind of solidified that states couldn't change their minds and authorize gambling in the ways that Nevada had for years. And then the internet comes about, and companies start taking bets over the internet to circumvent that law. And the Bush administration in the 2000s passes a law that says you can't bet over the internet, and no matter where you are, because that's also a violation of this concept that we don't want legal betting taking place outside of Nevada. But thanks to a clause that Major League Baseball had pushed for, that law made an exception for fantasy sports. Baseball was in favor of that because fantasy sports had kind of jump started their audience. Baseball's audience has been diminishing for a while now, but fantasy is a useful stimulus for that because it makes you interested in so many more games than you might have been otherwise. The thing about fantasy though is even if you bet a little bit of money there's let's say your league has a buy-in or something like that, it doesn't really feel like gambling because you might you might pay $20 to enter a league, and then in baseball case, you might get paid out 7 months later, or even in football, months later. It doesn't really feel like gambling under those circumstances. But some entrepreneurs around 2010 thought, the most fun aspect of fantasy sports is often picking your roster, drafting, or finding some other method of deciding who will be on your team, and then managing that over the months after that isn't always as fun. So why not strip it down so that you're drafting on a weekly or even daily basis? And they called this daily fantasy sports, and that's what FanDuel and DraftKings focused on initially. And they quite clearly exploited that fantasy loophole in the 2006 law, updating the 1992 law. And as a result, they were operating in all 50 states, or so. They were clearly offering a product that was much more reminiscent of gambling because the advertising was so on the nose, saying this is a way to win money. People win, look at all these people who've won jackpot daily fantasy prizes. That could be you. And there were surveys that they did that confirmed that money was the primary motivator for playing in a way that it wasn't for traditional fantasy sports. It's noteworthy that those companies like FanDuel and DraftKings got such an advantage in refining the technology to allow that sort of activity, forming partnerships with the leagues and with teams to advertise, even just developing brand recognition where people thought of them as the place to bet online, even before it was technically called betting, in a way that you didn't think of if you thought about like a Caesars or an MGM or these other legacy casino giants. And those companies, they saw what was happening and they realized that daily fantasy was essentially gambling by a different name, but they didn't want to jeopardize their licenses in Nevada because eventually a lot of states said, hey, you're flouting gambling laws to offer gambling in our states. We're not going to allow that. Nevada was very firm about that, as was New York at one point, and Illinois, and Massachusetts, and California. All of them were eventually saying, "We're not so sure about this. It seems like you're basically illegal bookies, even if you're calling it daily fantasy." But it ended up giving FanDuel and DraftKings this enormous head start, and they were preparing ahead of the Supreme Court decision in 2018 so that immediately they could pivot to sports betting. And now that's overwhelmingly the focus of their business. And daily fantasy was quickly kind of sidelined because really they owned up that was basically a Trojan horse. So they could position themselves. So if sports gambling were ever expanded outside of Nevada, they would have an almost insurmountable lead in seizing that market.
So the fundamental difference is the daily fantasy sports is they're picking teams, they're maybe doing it on a weekly basis. It's a little bit more aligned with what fantasy was. Maybe everybody was already kind of pre-programmed to understand, your fantasy sports league from The Office. But it progressively started leaning them more into this gambling direction. So it was like a pretty even, smooth thing. Is like now sports booking is legal. Now we just basically nudge that customer base right over into the sports book, and we're off and running.
Yeah, and I spoke with people who worked at FanDuel as they were making that pivot, and they said that in states that legalized sports betting, they converted up to 90% of customers. And you think about it, they've got your, deposit method on file, they have your email. It was so easy for them to reach out to those people and say, hey, through a little effort, you can become sports bettors. And also, they'd clearly conditioned people to be interested in sports gambling because, as we've discussed, this whole like, is it a game of skill or a game of chance thing, which seems now so academic and silly to debate. Um, the motivation was much more in line with gambling than with fantasy. But the other thing that it did was it fundamentally changed the relationship that these companies have with their customers because as a daily fantasy operator, it's more similar to if you're running a poker website or a poker room where you're not competing with the poker players as the house. In poker, they call it a rake, where you take a piece of the pot that's on the table. In daily fantasy, it's similar, where they take like 10% of the money that's pooled in these daily fantasy tournaments. Um, but they're not, it's what's called peer to peer. You're not competing against the house. Whereas as soon as they pivoted to gambling, that changed, and you are in competition with the bookmaker. And so not only does that change the nature of the odds and who wins and loses, but it also creates a much more adversarial relationship with your customers. And I spoke with people who were very high up at FanDuel, and they said that rubbed them the wrong way, that suddenly trying to crush your customers and bleed them dry was not what they had gotten in the business for. And they found that um, sort of off-putting, and like they felt an emotional conflict once that became the emphasis of their jobs. And I found that very interesting. And if you just look at every aspect of the gambling business, from how it's promoted, these new customer enticements, the way that the odds can be misleading, all of that is reflective of that adversarial relationship that's at the root of that business.
I mean, maybe double clicking on that a little bit is if somebody's a novice and they go, okay, they're doing a sports book and everything, how do they make money, right? Because it's kind of a winner take all scenario here. Um, Fundamentally, how do companies like FanDuel and DraftKings make their money?
At the root of it, there's an inherent advantage baked into the odds, and you'll notice this. Let's say you're looking at a game and you say, "I'm going to bet on both teams." The odds are such so that you don't get, if it's what's called a straight bet, like you're betting, against the spread, the most kind of neutral thing you could find, you're betting at a slight, it's not quite a one-to-one payout. So let's say you bet $20 on one team to win and they won. You wouldn't win $20, and therefore if you lose, you lose $20. If you win, you get your $20 back plus like $18. And over time, that disparity is going to give the sports books their profit. Sometimes people misunderstand this and they think that the sports books goal is to balance the money so that they're going to get that inherent edge. The VIG is going to give them their margin. It goes a little bit deeper than that because they really want to be on the right side of the bet. They want to have they actually want to be aligned with the professional gamblers so that they don't just win thanks to that skewing of the odds, but they win even more than that because the recreational customers are going to be on the wrong side of the odds, even beyond a 50-50 split. And that can get a little complicated. But thanks to that inherent edge baked into the odds, the sportsbooks have an upper hand. And despite that, people think of sports betting differently than they do other casino games. Like, hopefully, if you sit down at a blackjack table or a roulette wheel, you understand that the game is skewed so that you're not going to win money in the long term. The same logic and math apply to sports betting, and yet because it feels like a battle of wit and a battle of sports knowledge, you kid yourself into thinking you can outsmart the bookmaker, especially with your favorite team or your favorite league, or if you have some sort of insight, or so you think you can leverage that to win money and overcome the house edge. And it's so seductive and it just leads people to the most irrational thinking because it doesn't work that way. It takes unbelievable skill and discipline to break even. Even you have to win about 52.5% of the time if you're placing those straight bets, to say nothing of types of bets that give the house an even greater edge. But if you're just betting on, let's say, football games against the point spread, the most kind of standard form of betting, winning 52.5% of the time, basically outsmarting the market at that rate is an unbelievably tall task. I've spoken with some of the smartest pro gamblers in the world, and they say they've realized they can't even do that consistently. It's in the same way that an individual has such a difficult time picking stocks to outsmart the market. It's you're similarly facing an uphill battle when you're betting on the most popular sports in the US or anywhere. And yet, as we were discussing, because it feels like um, a game of a game of sports expertise, you can forget those fundamental disadvantages that you're playing against.
So you have the fundamental disadvantages, but there's also incorporation of things like parlays, which is a high risk, high reward scenario. So the chances of you hitting, 52% is very tough. Now imagine you do 52%, 52%, string it together four times. You could have a tremendous payout, but are those parlays the ones that's kind of supplementing or providing the most profitability for these sports books?
The math behind that is so important and it's so lost on most people. So just to step back for a sec, for listeners and viewers who don't know, a parlay combines multiple bets for the chance at winning much more than if you bet on them individually and they all won. The catch is that all of those bets that form a parlay have to be successful for you to get paid. If any one of them is unsuccessful, the bet is considered a loser and you forfeit all the money that you bet. And yet people think if I were just to win one of those parlays, it'll make up for all my losers. That big payout will give me profits in the long run. It doesn't work that way. Someone at FanDuel who was the head of product there for a while, he said he said not to be condescending, but I would guess that about 5% of customers understand that fact, that the house edge is so much greater for parlays that you're not the occasional winner is by no means gonna make up for all your losers. The typical margin for those straight bets is about 5%. So if a person were to wager $100, the house is going to collect $5 in the long run. For parlays, it can be as high as 30%. You're losing almost about 6 times more than the traditional way of betting on sports. It's remarkable, like what a difference that makes when you think about $150 billion are being wagered every year on sports. To think that people are losing it 6 times greater frequency than traditionally, that makes a massive difference. And it's important because in a lot of states, it was sold to the public as that narrow margin business. I used to live in Colorado, and I remember looking up the ballot referendum that Colorado voters were given to approve sports betting, and they literally had a graphic of a dollar bill, and it showed you the sports books expect to make 5 cents on every dollar wagered. Like that's the margin you should think about. I wonder if people had been told that it was actually potentially 6 times more than that, if they would have felt as good about legalizing. The other thing that's so treacherous with parlays is I learned that people talk about dopamine as this brain chemical that's so important in why gambling can be so enticing. And what I learned is that people think about dopamine as when you get your big payoff. It's actually when you're pursuing a reward. Serotonin is the chemical you get when you actually get the prize. Dopamine is released in the brain when when you think you're on the verge of seizing that reward. And if you think about it with parlays, it's a very intense dopamine experience because the odds can be misleading in that, let's say it's a 5 leg parlay where you're betting on 5 different things to be successful. If you go 4 out of 5 and the odds are 50-50 on all of those legs, it's actually 5 times more likely to go 4 out of 5 than 5 out of 5. If you did a 10 leg parlay, you're 10 times more likely to go 9 out of 10 than 10 out of 10. And yet, if you ask someone, you said, hey, you went 4 out of 5 on your parlay, you lost, but you got 4 out of 5 right, they're going to have a very intense dopamine experience and they're going to think, wow, I'm onto something. I was this close to winning. I should keep at this and keep betting these parlays because I'm right on the verge of that big payout. And it's kind of similar to how on a slot machine, you'll come so close to that last bar being where it needs to be to give you the big payday. But for all these reasons, the math is just very deceptive. And a lot of people who aren't sophisticated and understand these ins and outs get drawn into placing what people refer to as sucker bets. These are the worst bets you could be placing as a customer. And yet, for a lot of people now, especially young people, that's all they're betting are these long shot parlays.
These companies come along. Their plan is to eventually get to sports books. Now, this Supreme Court ruling kind of unlocks the door, and it seems like they had planned for that to happen, and they pretty quickly, Control C, Control V, dropped this, you know, framework in virtually every state. And I think, what is it, 39 states now have sports books. So they really like it's like overnight they distributed it to the rest of the United States.
Yes, I liked learning about something that they dubbed Project Aftermath, which was a strategy game planning that the sports books at the time they were operating as daily fantasy companies, but these giants like FanDuel and DraftKings and the leagues, mainly the NBA and Major League Baseball, Project Aftermath was their strategy for exactly as you said, if the Supreme Court ruled in favor of expanding gambling outside of Nevada, they would be poised to lobby states so aggressively so that not only would they legalize very quickly, but they would pass the legislation that FanDuel and DraftKings had drafted, and they would be in such a hurry to do that they wouldn't establish the regulatory frameworks that you need to police this appropriately. Like, it's a much different business to regulate than a lottery or even a casino industry. The ins and outs that we've been talking about require some expertise, and all over the place in a lot of those 38 or so states that you referenced, it's kind of a joke how regulators are so outgunned and it's such a learning curve that they tend to just side with the industry again and again, especially whenever there's a dispute that a customer is raising. They lack the know-how to investigate the operators and make sense of this kind of esoteric stuff that goes into the modern betting business. And that's a huge problem. But yeah, the fact that this happened so quickly is essential to the story. And I really dive into that in the book because you might wonder, like, you've banned betting for all these years. What was the rush? Why did it have to happen in a matter of months in some states? Why did they need to throw together a regulatory body for, the Super Bowl coming up in the near future, as opposed to taking the time to get this off the ground in a way that would look out for customers? And it's kind of baffling to me still, but at least I'm able to shed some light on that in the book.
So what was the big sales pitch for the states? Was it just like, hey, you can just have this much more tax revenue, to either fill budget holes or, activate your new projects? What was kind of their sales pitch to these legislators that basically pushed it right on through?
Taxing was a big piece. There's always an gambling is always attractive from a tax standpoint whenever states are facing budget deficits and it's unpopular to raise income taxes. And if you think about it, a lot of this was exploding during COVID. So states had a lot of spending problems that they needed to overcome. And the idea that you could just flip a switch and have this new industry that would generate you supposedly a lot of tax revenue was appealing. They also argued that this is happening already through the black market. So why wouldn't you want to tax it and regulate it? And as I mentioned earlier, that argument had been compelling in some states with marijuana. So lawmakers were already conditioned to see the logic of that for cannabis. And then with gambling, a similar argument was presented, and that was very convincing. But they vastly overstated the size of the black market. And it was kind of a scare tactic of, you won't believe the billions of dollars being wagered every year through illegal operators. And there's no doubt that some of that was occurring, but the numbers that they quoted were so inflated. And the New York Times, years later, did some very impressive reporting to investigate kind of how absurd and unscientific those estimates were that were being passed around. And then in my book, I follow up on that and spoke with some people who reveal that it's sort of a joke, these numbers that were being quoted state by state, and yet that was persuasive. And the last thing I'd say was the leagues were campaigning for this by then, and their argument was this will actually improve the integrity of sports because there's all this illegal betting and we can't monitor that. And if people are fixing games or betting when they shouldn't be, a modern Pete Rose, maybe the most infamous athlete and then manager to be caught betting on his own games. If that's happening now, it'd be nice to be able to monitor betting data through a legalized industry so that we could flag inappropriate betting. And that was very convincing. But the reality is that was also incredibly disingenuous because, for one, there still is a black market, and anyone who knows anything about fixing is going to go through street bookies or Asian or Latin American operators. They're not all of a sudden going to go bet on FanDuel if they want to fix a game. Some of that happens, but it's really kind of the most clumsy, unsophisticated fixers who are doing that. It's not the multinational gambling syndicates that have done some of the most harmful fixing over the years. They know what they're doing. They're not going to be caught that easily. So that problem hasn't been thwarted. But the bigger problem is that by legalizing, as we were discussing, you've created so many new ways to bet. It's easier than ever to make a ton of money fixing a game in ways that are way more subtle than saying, we're going to make my team lose. You know, the Black Sox example of throwing the World Series to make a lot of money. You don't need to do anything close than that to make millions of dollars nowadays. If you were simply to say, I'm going to remove myself from a game, and people who've bet on how many rebounds I'll get, or how many assists I'll get. I'm drawing from a guy on the Toronto Raptors, a bench player named Jonte Porter, who was banned for life a couple years ago because he was found to have done that in collusion with some gamblers. That sort of stuff is very difficult to catch and very, very easy if you're a player. And it's like, you know, really, if I say I've hurt myself and I'm going to come out of a game, that the Porter example is an outlier in that they found him, and they found him for some, as I was saying, uh, avoidable mistakes that the fixers made. But that I've heard so many people in sports, and even at the companies that are tasked with this so-called integrity monitoring, these vendors who are responsible for observing betting data and investigating if they catch a red flag, they themselves admit it's easier than ever to corrupt sports, and it might be harder than ever to catch that just because there's so much ground to cover.
Yeah, I mean the data volume has got to be incredible if you got what is it, 70 million people or something that placing a bet every day. Like, how many terabytes of data are you kind of going through? It's like a needle in a haystack.
Right. And one of the biggest companies is called Sport Radar. They do that service for the NBA and Major League Baseball and a bunch of colleges and other sports leagues. They have like a few dozen investigators who are looking at millions of games and billions of data points every year. And that's just it's common sense that that's way, way, way too much ground to cover. And yeah, they themselves say like sometimes we can catch the red flags, but there are a lot of false alarms, and then doing all the legwork to investigate and collecting, evidence to support saying this was actually a fixed game, that is just untenable. And this remember, as we were saying, this was the argument for legalization was we're going to catch all these fixers. It now seems like there's probably more fixers than ever, and they just don't stand a chance of catching all of them.
That kind of leads me into the league question here. Is the league was like no betting at all, severely punished those. P. Rose is never going to get a Hall of Fame because of what he did, um, and completely taboo. And then overnight it became, oh, well, we're just going to put it on broadcasts. We're going to pretty much emphasize, we're going to make shows about it. What, what was the pivot?
For like the media companies,
Yeah, media and even the leagues themselves.
it's similar, but I think it is worth separating them. So for the leagues, I loved this story, and being able to tell it in the book, and I'll give you the very short version here, which was after Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, came out publicly in favor of legalization in 2014, the gambling industry started commissioning these studies that uh, looked into not just one question was how much more sports do gamblers consume compared to traditional fans? And we kind of know intuitively that gamblers watch a lot of games, but to document it through this very robust study that looked at 500 gamblers and non-gamblers over the course of an NFL season, and found that the gamblers were watching more than twice as many games as the traditional fans, and they were also watching just a lot more minutes of sports in general because they're watching to the ends of blowouts to see if bet how a bet plays out when the game itself has long since been decided. They took that data and they brought it in meetings with all the leagues and with some of those media companies, and they said to the leagues, your most valuable asset is your TV rights. It's the right to show pro and college sports. By far, that's the biggest moneymaker for sports. And what we're seeing is people are canceling cable subscriptions. Young people don't want to sit through a 3 or 4 hour game. Your audience is getting older, especially for baseball. That was a big problem for Major League Baseball is the average age had gotten like a decade older in just a decade or so. And this could reverse that because look, gamblers are hyper engaged. They're rabid consumers of sports. You can turbocharge your TV audience, and that's going to solidify that bedrock of your business. And that I think is why the leagues got on board and found these other more politically convenient reasons for claiming they were now proponents of gambling. It was to shore up their TV audience. And then the media, they often follow the lead of the leagues. So when the leagues did that, that gave them cover to say, okay, I guess we should cover gambling now and make it a part of our coverage. But they also just got flooded with gambling advertising, billions of dollars spent in marketing deals with sports media because sports media, it's not just getting the word out about here's a company you can bet on and all that. They were instrumental in normalizing gambling, taking it from something that you do kind of discreetly, not something you want to make a big show about if you're a gambler, to making it seem like just the default way of engaging with sports and kind of like everyone's doing it. And if your favorite columnist or podcast host or the studio analysts who are talking about the game that's about to come on, if all of them are saying, here's who I'd bet on, or here are the bets I'd recommend, that just made it seem much more innocent and harmless and like something worth exploring if you're a fan. And that I think made a huge difference. And what I heard talking to people in media who were inking those deals, they just said like we knew that it might be wrong to become proponents of gambling. We had been resistant to that for so many years, but a lot of media is fighting for survival and treading water in a pretty precarious way. I mean, we just saw the Washington Post kill its sports section a couple of weeks ago. So, in that climate, they just couldn't stand on principle and turn down billions of dollars in ad revenue. The money was too good to pass up for them.
I kind of think about it now as okay, if I'm a brand new, I've never done sports betting, I've never done daily fantasy. Hey, they have it on my phone. Like Apple lets it be in the App Store. Let me get it. And then, hey, my favorite, podcaster or media personality is telling me about his picks, and the leagues seem to embrace it on their main broadcasts. How it gives you almost kind of moral license to like, hey, let's go for it. It can't be that bad, if everybody else is doing it. So, do you think that's what kind of spurs the amount of usage today?
No doubt. Ed, that's a big side of it. And as a reporter, it makes it just it depresses me honestly because the real public trust of journalism is that you're looking out for your audience's best interests. And this was such a betrayal of that because thanks to all of that advertising, so many sports journalists were looking out for what was in the best interest of their gambling sponsors. And whether that was promoting the worst types of bets if you want to win money, all these long shot parlays, or just biting their tongues when it came to covering the full story of what's happening with the betting boom. And I heard from a lot of people who said, think of how intimidating it would be if you wanted to write a story or broadcast a story on your podcast or your TV show about the downsides of what's happening it's for health or the corruption of sports or the predatory tactics of this business. Are you really going to chase away one of your top advertisers to tell that story? That is a huge conflict of interest. As someone who used to work at ESPN, named Henry Abbott told me, It's as if sports media is being bribed by all of that advertising, bribed to pull punches and not go down reporting or commentary avenues that would be embarrassing for both gambling companies, but also the sports leagues for partnering with those companies. And I used the word betrayal a moment ago. That just feels like the appropriate way of describing this because in that way and in other ways, it feels like you're really misleading your audience if that's what's motivating you and not telling the truth about everything that's happening.
I think we've really dove into the downside of it. Now, on the upside, on the positive here, people that maybe they got some disposable income, it gets them engaged with the games, the benefit there. Now, the downside of it is you could get completely addicted, you could lose your house, you could, ruin your life basically. There's such an asymmetric risk analysis here. Is there is there a way that sports and gambling can coexist in a very reasonable way?
At least a more reasonable way. Because I always like to, acknowledge it can be incredibly fun. It can be thrilling to be thinking about a bet and, imagining the money you'd win if your bet's successful while you're watching a sport. It's kind of like watching sports on steroids if you've got a bet on the line. The problem is not just the money you can lose and the health risks that you described, but also eventually that changes your relationship with sports. And that I think is something I didn't really want to hammer in the book because there's other things that I think are more, it's easier for people to say, wow, these business tactics are predatory that the industry is using. Like that's a very convincing story. But I do hope people think about how it changes the nature of fandom. But when you asked about, is there a more moderate version of this? Maybe. I mean, for one, there not every state allows online betting, and there might be something to be said for if you actually have to go to a casino, that can help you moderate how much you're betting. If you limited the types of bets that you place so that you're not betting on that minute by minute basis that we were discussing, but if this is more of like a place your bets and then sit back and watch, maybe that could help you moderate what you're doing. There's a lot of consumer protections that can help people set limits on how much they're willing to lose, how often they're willing to bet, that have been adopted in other countries. But the problem is they were only adopted after things got really out of hand. And I wonder if that's what it'll take in the US is a public health crisis, a surge of gambling among kids, the corruption of sports on a massive and destructive level. Maybe that's what it'll take for people to wake up and say, trusting the industry to self-police and to put those guardrails in place clearly isn't working. We as regulators or lawmakers or even as the leagues, because they have a lot of clout whenever they push for something with gambling. If people decide that that's what's called for, that would make a big difference without going back to banning gambling. But what it'll take to swing people to see it that way, can be pretty grim.
Danny, I think that's a great way to leave it off here. Um, one of the last things before we leave is just kind of share with us what is the name of your book? Where can people find you on social media and learn about your work?
The book is Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. You can buy it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and any online retailer. Hopefully, it's in your local bookstore too. Uh, you can reach me on social media at Danny Funt, Funt. I love hearing from people when they read the book or just have experiences with betting that they want to share. So, to anyone in your audience, please reach out. I'd be delighted to hear from you. And thank you, Riley. This was a great convo. I'm grateful that you had me on your show.
Danny, appreciate your work. Thank you.